while we wait. The 1 minute. So, who's been to one of our pop-up presentations before? So the whole idea behind a pop-up presentation was to fill the void for people that did not want to commit to a Sunday school class. We wanted to make it available to people who said, listen, I don't want to be there every week. I want to choose what interests me, and then I want to go, and then I want to go about my way. It was never our intention to take away from people that are already lovingly planted in a Sunday school class. And I'm proud to say I think that has not happened. We work well with our Sunday school teachers who are a part of this ministry to make sure that we are complementing what they're doing and not taking away from the people, from the classes that are already happening. And I'm not even kidding you, he's not here. He is. We are doing one every other month this year. You'll see that in your bulletin, and we're trying to make them varied, but we do tend to stay a lot, very much planted in the history of the church, the specific church, St. Augustine, Henry Flagler. But we are excited about a video project that we're doing, and it is called A Day in the Life of Our Ministers. And so our plan is that our videographer will follow them for 24 hours, and we will edit it down so you can see how they really do move through their lives, and we're really excited about that. And it's too bad I don't have that ready today, since he's not here yet. Are you kidding me? Do you want me to hand those out?
Yeah.
We have handouts.
And wait, hang on one more.
We have 2 handouts. Literally, I was going to do a sing-along.
Oh, well, I'll sit down there. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for showing up. So we talked about doing something Flagler related, and so Stacy and I have breakfast over at Anastasia Diner, and that's where we cook up all these wonderful ideas. But what I thought would be interesting is to talk about, what do I call this, the Merry Housewives of Henry Flagler. And the women in Flagler's life are very interesting women, but you can't start talking about the wives unless you start with Flagler's mother, Elizabeth. And she had been married 3 times, which was not unusual in those days. She had married a man whose last name was Morrison first, and that's where Flagler gets his middle name. Henry Morrison Flagler was from Elizabeth's first husband who died. She married a second husband, a Dr. Harkness, which we should recognize the Harkness name, and he passed away. And then her third husband was Flagler's father, Zechariah Flagler. He was quite a character. He was a Presbyterian minister. From what I have read, and going over Dr. Graham's book, which is a great resource, by the way, too, if you're looking for some more up-to-date information about Flagler, it's a great resource. Mr. Flagler, St. Augustine, probably the best. If you haven't read anything about Flagler, Last Train to Paradise is a great book that gives you a brief introduction about Flagler and his life, and it frames it in the construction of the overseas railroad down to Key West. And then if you really want to get a little bit more of the dirt, Mr. Flagler's St. Augustine is a great book to read as well. But I think Flagler's mother had a predominant effect on his life. Flagler's father was, as I said, a Presbyterian minister, but he moved around. And so he was very often not at home as when Flagler was a young man or young boy. Flagler leaves at the age of 14 and moves to Bellevue, Ohio, which is where the Harkness family lived, and that is where Elizabeth Harkness had lived when she was married to the doctor. And then she moved to New York upstate New York, and Flagler grew up in this little town called Hopewell Junction, which was still, it's just a community. It's like a unincorporated little town. There's not much there, and I don't think there was much there to begin with. And so really it's under his mother's suggestion that he moves to Bellevue and take advantage of that family connection with the Harknesses. Layman Harkness, who ends up being Flagler's father-in-law later, a few years later, had owned a group of stores in that area. And so Flagler went to go work in the store. Now he had about, they say, like, just a few cents in his pocket when he left Hopewell and went to Bellevue. And so Flagler sleeps under the sales counter in the store. There's a little bed that he makes, and that's where he sleeps until he makes enough money that he can afford a home. And at that point, he has decided, once he's able to afford a home, that he's going to marry his first wife. So early on, he learns about family connections. He learns the sales. He learns from Layman Harkness about how to sell alcohol, that it was all in one big vat, but everybody had a different price. So if you went to a wealthy man, you would sell just a little bit more. The price would be a little bit higher for him. Maybe somebody who's buying in bulk, you lower that price a little bit. So Flagler learned very early on the tricks of commerce and how to be a good salesman. And he does very, very well. Layman Harkness is very impressed with Flagler, and of course he would have to be because he ends up marrying his daughter. And Mary Harkness was kind of an anomaly at this time period because Layman Harkness wanted his children to have the finer things in life. Did anybody read my article in the newsletter this week? You know what happens when people don't read before class? No, I'm kidding. But he wanted the finer things in life for his children. And so he sent Mary Harkness abroad, which only means into the South, into Savannah, to learn, to be educated. And of course, this would have been a girls' school or women's type college. So they're not learning about mathematics and science and all of that. They're learning, the classics, reading, and that sort of thing. So Mary Harkness would have been a very intelligent woman and somebody that Flagler would have probably been able to sit down with and have a very good conversation. Now keep in mind, she probably was more educated than Flagler because Flagler left when he was 14. He didn't graduate beyond the 4th grade. Mary Harkness went to really a finishing school, so she probably read a lot more and knew a lot more than Henry Flagler did. And that's something that Flagler carries through his whole life. As much as we kind of downplay it a little bit, Flagler was very much about education. And Mary Lily, his third wife, was really very well educated. Ida Alice is kind of a mystery, and we'll talk a little bit more about her. So in our handout, there's a picture of Flagler when he's much younger, and this is not the Flagler that we're used to seeing. This is the dashing, debonair, young Flagler. And in that picture, Mary Harkness is in the back with that interesting hat on. Looks kind of like, I don't know what kind of hat that is. Anyway, but sitting in front of her is her sister Isabel. And Isabel marries Daniel Harkness, which was Flagler's, I think it was Daniel, it might have been Stephen. But anyway, it was, they were all related, but they were related by marriage because Flagler's mother married into the Harkness family, so they weren't really like, this wasn't incest in any stretch of the imagination. And Isabel is the same way with Mary. They're sisters, and so they maintain a very close relationship. Isabel marries another Harkness, which would have been probably her first or second cousin. That was a little bit more murky than Flagler and Mary Harkness's marriage. But the house that Flagler ends up building is the picture to the right, and that was the gingerbread house in Bellevue. It has been torn down. When Flagler left Bellevue and moved to Cleveland with J.D. Rockefeller and began to get involved in Standard Oil, he sells the house to his, essentially his brother-in-law, Isabel's husband. And so they move into that house, and it sits right next door to the Congregational Church that Flagler's brother-in-law, Isabel's husband, built in memory of Isabel, because Isabel dies. And it is vacant. It's a vacant church now. It's a gorgeous, if you go in and look up Congregational Church, Bellevue, Ohio, it's a beautiful church, and I can't find any interior pictures of it, just the exterior pictures. But the fact that here we have a church built in memory of a family member kind of is suggestive. Mary Hartness's picture is on the bottom left. Kind of what we would imagine Henry Flagler's wife to be. When they're living in Bellevue, they have 2 children. They have Jenny Louise, who is their eldest daughter, and then they have a little girl named Carrie. And Carrie lives for about 3 years and then dies from tuberculosis. Mary, at this time, contracts tuberculosis, and it follows her really to Cleveland and then to New York, and she ultimately succumbs to tuberculosis in 1881. But I would imagine the loss of Carrie was pretty profound. And right now, she is the only member of the Flagler family that's still buried in Bellevue. When Flagler had the mausoleum added here, he did not move Carrie here, and I'm not sure why. But anyway, ironically though, in that same cemetery, Flagler had his mother and father, when they passed away, he bought plots for them, and that may be why Carrie was not moved. So Zachariah and Elizabeth were buried in Bellevue, Ohio. Years later, when Jean Flagler Matthews is going around looking at all the different Flagler sites in the country to find out about her grandfather, this is Harry's daughter, she came to St. Augustine. She became very involved with our church. Kirkside had already been torn down by that point, and she ultimately saved Whitehall, and that's where the Flagler Museum comes from, is Jean Flagler Matthews. Anyway, she goes to Bellevue. She finds Zachariah and Elizabeth's grave, as well as Carrie's, and she has Zachariah and Elizabeth move to the Flagler Cemetery in upstate New York around Hopewell Junction. Why she didn't move Carrie, I don't know. But anyway, the picture with Mary Hartness and the baby, that baby is Harry. Now, his formal name was Henry Harkness Flagler, but he went by Harry. And my favorite thing, well, one of my favorite things, because I love to pick on the trolleys, and it's easy pickings too. The story was that I heard from them was that Harry disowned his father and went by his mother's maiden name. Like, no, that's actually his middle name. And why would he disown his father? I mean, if I had a millionaire father, I don't care how bad the relationship is, I'm gonna at least send him a Christmas card. So, and somebody, Stacey, you're gonna keep me on time, right? Okay, thank you, because somebody needs to do that. So they end up living in Bellevue. Flagler gets involved in the salt industry, loses all of it after the war, after the Civil War. So he and J.D. Rockefeller both hired substitutes. And this is an interesting concept to us, that if you were wealthy enough, you could pay for someone to serve in the Civil War in your place. And Flagler and J.D. Rockefeller did that. And one of the reasons why Flagler had the ability to do that is because he was involved in the salt business, which was very integral to the war machine at that time for preserving meat. And right at the end of the Civil War, the salt market crashes and he loses everything. So he's penniless. He comes back to Bellevue, and the Hartnesses bail him out. They give him money, and he comes back and he starts working for them again. And then at some point, he gets involved. He starts to go into Cleveland, and he ends up meeting this young man named John D. Rockefeller. They used to ride the train together into Cleveland, and that's how they got to know each other. And this is the beginning of a lifelong friendship. You talk about a bromance. This is the ultimate bromance. And Flagler ends up getting this, or J.D. Rockefeller talks to him about this idea of Standard Oil, about creating an oil company. At that time, Cleveland was the center of oil production in the United States. It only changes once Oklahoma and Texas come on the scene and they start drilling in Oklahoma and Texas. But J.D. Rockefeller starts getting into the oil business, and so he brings in a bunch of partners. One of them is Samuel Andrews, who ends up, he becomes kind of a thorn in the side of J.D. Rockefeller, and so J.D. Rockefeller, or he tells J.D. Rockefeller one day, if you give me $1 million, I will step out of the company and I'll be happy with my $1 million. Believe it or not, J.D. Rockefeller writes him a check and hands it to him, and Samuel Andrews is out. And that opens up the place for Flagler. And the Hartness family provides the money and says, I'll give you this money if you bring Henry Flagler on as a partner. And that's how Flagler gets into Standard Oil. So again, it's that family connection that comes about. So they end up moving to Cleveland. They get a house on Euclid Avenue, which was the Avenue of Millionaires. He's right down the street from J.D. Rockefeller. They centralize operations in downtown Cleveland. And Flagler and J.D. Rockefeller have desks that are together, so they're facing each other all day long. They walk home together to go have lunch. J.D. Rockefeller goes to his house, Flagler goes to his. He's, at this time, probably a caretaker to Mary Harkness, although I'm sure they would have servants and someone else helping, but he checks on Mary. And then at night, when they would leave the office, they would walk home together and talk business. So it's 24/7 Standard Oil, Standard Oil, Standard Oil. Ultimately, the decision is made to move Standard Oil from from Cleveland and move it to New York. And that's when the company really starts to expand. And again, Flagler and Rockefeller buy houses not too far from each other. They don't build them, they buy them. And then they have them renovated to their tastes. Not ostentatious, not like an Astor family home or the Vanderbilt homes. These are pretty plain looking mansions. That sounds kind of like an oxymoron, but that's kind of what they would do. Flagler's home had a larger stable than Rockefeller's, and Rockefeller was really into horses. And so Flagler just swaps stables with J.D. Rockefeller so that J.D. can have a bunch more horses. And Flagler's like, I'll just have 2 or whatever in my carriages, and that's all I need. Ironically, Flagler's house now is the Gucci store. I don't know how we would feel about that. Gucci, yeah. So it's during this time, now Harry was born in Cleveland, and so he's just a little baby when they moved to New York. And Mary Hartness was probably getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and it's during that time that they come to Florida. And it's because of Mary Hartness, because at that time, we're talking about 1883, well, actually not 1883, because she died in 81. This was probably late 1870s, maybe, early 1880s. She is not doing well. Doctor recommends coming to Florida. First thing they do is they come down to Jacksonville. They stay at the St. James Hotel. Then they board a steamboat, and they come down, and they make their trip to Coy, which was where you would join the St. John's Railroad, which was at first a horse-drawn trolley and then became steam locomotive or wood-burning locomotive later. Anybody know where Tukoi is? Like if you drive straight out 214 on West King and you just keep going, you're going to run right into it, because that's actually the old railroad bed for that railroad. It's nothing now, and probably wasn't much then. There were a couple of houses there. But you would get off the steamboat at the little dock, get on the train, and then you would come into town. Meanwhile, you're fighting Florida heat and probably mosquitoes the size of small birds. It would have been a lovely trip by rail into St. Augustine. What a welcome. Flagler was not impressed at all, because there were nothing but consumptives around. All these people coughing and hacking. I mean, it would have been worse than COVID-19. And he tries for Mary's sake, but then he's like, I can't do it. And so they end up going back to New York, and of course, she dies in December of 1881. And her death really marks a turning point for him, I think, because it's that point when he steps away from Standard Oil. And I think he's looking for something different. He's looking for somewhere where he can make a really big impact. And so this is where we hit Ida Alice. And Ida Alice's picture is on the back side of your handout. That is the only picture of her that exists. There's a really bad drawing from a newspaper that gets circulated around as a picture of her, but this is the only picture. And the funny thing about her is Sidney Martin, when he wrote his book about Flagler, interviewed the gardener, actually the gardener's daughter of Flagler. Flagler had a gardener in New York, and then he promotes him to the head gardener for the Palm Beach hotels. And it's his daughter that provides a lot of information about Ida Alice to Sidney Martin. And that's where we hear the rumor about her being an actress and then being her being a nurse and paid companion to Mary Harkness. Harry Harkness's reaction is, that's just a bunch of baloney. He said, the only time I ever heard the name Ida Alice Schwartz was when my father was telling us that he was marrying her. And then my Aunt Carrie, who was Flagler's older half-sister, and Harry went and paid a visit to her, and that was the first time he ever saw her. So your guess is as good as mine as to what brought them together. The fact that she was an actress is true. The fact that she was a nurse apparently is not true. So go figure. Harry wasn't real complimentary to Ida Alice. Sidney Martin explained that Flagler was attracted to Ida Alice for her beauty. Harry said, actually, that's not true either. She was kind of plain. She had a good figure. She had pretty hair, but that was about it. So, go figure. But it's with Ida Alice that Flagler comes to St. Augustine again. And this time is a completely different situation. They come to St. Augustine and find the San Marco Hotel, which is the first luxury hotel here in St. Augustine, and it's where the Visitor Information Center is today. And they were impressed. Flagler was very impressed by the hotels and the amenities that they offered, and the fact that there weren't a bunch of people coughing everywhere. There were actually wealthy Northerners who were taking excursions over to Anastasia Island, going boating, and he began to realize, this might be something to think about. In the mix, in this time period, he meets Andrew Anderson, Dr. Andrew Anderson, who owned Markland House. And Dr. Anderson went to school in New York and had friends in New York. And so we know that Flagler had friends that were friends of the family. And so somewhere in this mix, he meets Dr. Andrew Anderson, and the seeds are planted for the Hotel Ponce de Leon, and then, of course, the Alcazar. So Flagler figures out pretty quickly that this is where he needs to be and what he can do here in St. Augustine. And so the idea for the hotel and all of that stuff begins. So when the hotel opens, Flagler, the story about the hotel opening, the day that the hotel actually opened, the first opening, every season they would do the same ceremony, and they would come out to the front of the hotel, the guests would be there, and probably a lot of the townies, and they would fire a cannon, and then they would lift the gate in this real showy thing. Now, the Ponce de Leon was the first building that was electrified in St. Augustine, and so on their very first opening, the story is that Henry Flagler, during this ceremony, points at the building, and as soon as he points to the building, the lights come on. So if you can imagine a bunch of St. Augustinians looking at this and being like, wow, they've never seen electricity ever, and here we are, this guy is bringing electricity to our town. Nevertheless, Ida Alice really does kind of fall into the social scene. She becomes a very good customer of Tiffany's in New York, wears a lot of the jewelry, a lot of fine clothes. Flagler had purchased a winter home, or I guess you could call a country estate, in Mamaroneck in New York. He purchased it for Mary Harkness to get away from the city and help with her symptoms. He has it redone when he marries Ida Alice, and so they use that as kind of their country estate. And I'm not sure where I was going with that. But anyway, so Flagler's got several properties. Originally, Flagler had a suite of hotel rooms in the Ponce, which was later where the Keenans ended up staying when they would come to the hotel. And ultimately, Flagler decides to build a home in St. Augustine. And in all of his urban planning of the city and layout and all that, he had reserved a portion from Sevilla Street back to Riberia to be his home and his estate. And so Carrere and Hastings designed a colonial revival home with large columns, and you can see that picture is Kirkside on your handout. It's during this time that Flagler's first oldest daughter, Jeannie Louise, passes away, and that's where we come in. Flagler had envisioned this church being built down at the corner of Cordova and Valencia, where Thompson Baker is today, because it was the Dragoon lot, and it was a barracks for the Spanish. There wasn't anything there, but Flagler purchased that lot, and apparently he could not get a clear title in time, so he just took a portion of his estate, lopped it off, and gave it to the church to build. So that's how we wound up here rather than down the street. And so all of that is happening at the same time that the hotels are beginning. Now, how he gets into the railroad business is kind of a roundabout way. He had approached, there were several regional railroads, and if you read the newsletter, the latest article is about the Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Halifax River Railroad. And so he purchases all these little railroads and combines them. He had gone to the owners of the Jacksonville, St. Augustine, Halifax River Railroad and said, I want my hotel guests to be able to board their private cars in New Jersey, right outside of New York, and come down all the way to the St. Augustine Depot and be able to walk right into the hotel. They should not have to switch cars. They don't have to ride a ferry. This is the ideal luxury transportation. And the owners of the railroad are like, well, they had a narrow gauge railroad, questionable in terms of operation. They had a lot of delays, a lot of maintenance issues. And they're like, look, it's really just not worth the investment. It's a lot more money than we're willing to spend. So what do you think Flagler does? He just buys the railroad. And he does all of that. So he upgrades to standard gauge, he builds a bridge across the St. Johns River, and voila, his hotel guests now are coming down all the way to St. Augustine. So during all of this time, Flagler is focused on Florida. Ida Alice begins to show some kind of mental deficiencies. She is involved in spiritualism, which Harry Houdini at this time was involved in spiritualism. It was kind of a fad. You whipped out your Ouija board at parties and you tried to contact spirits. Apparently, she got in contact with the Tsar of Russia, who I don't know how because he was alive, but hey, whatever. She gets convinced that she's going to marry the Tsar of Russia, and Henry's in the way. So there's some bizarre behavior, some things that just don't add up, and so Henry ends up bringing in a doctor to have her evaluated. And ultimately, she tries to I think she tries to kill him. It's where she tries to stab him with some scissors or something. And she successfully stabs one of the doctors in the hand with a pair of scissors, and that pretty much does it. And she's sent to a sanitarium. And so Flagler is again alone, no wife, and here he is in the midst of all of this going on. So he begins to look for another partner. There are a couple of prospects, one of which is a woman named Alice Pomeroy, who ends up marrying Mary Lily's brother, William Rankinen. She comes down to Palm Beach, and apparently there are rumors that she and Flagler are an item, but then that ends up kind of fizzling. But there's a young woman in North Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina, named Mary Lily Keenan that catches his eye. And he begins, I think, to really think about his later years and wanting someone who's more of a comfort and caretaker for him, knowing that he will eventually need that. Now, Mary Lily is no stranger to the Flaglers. In fact, Ida Alice and Henry brought her down to the Ponce several times, and she was a soloist. She sang. She actually sang here in our church a couple of times. She sang at the Ponce to the hotel guests. She was a very accomplished singer and musician, and very prominent. Her best friends were the Pembroke Joneses, which, you know that saying, keeping up with the Joneses? Those were the Joneses. And so she was very good friends with them. So she was in a very prominent place in society to step in as the next Mrs. Flagler. Flagler realizes that in order to do this, he's probably got to divorce his second wife. So he first off sells his home in New York, changes his residency to Florida, and then asks the state legislature to pass a law that allowed for divorce on the grounds of insanity. In order to kind of grease the wheels a little bit, Flagler makes a donation of about $10,000 to what would become the University of Florida. It was an agricultural college at Lake City. And so, amazingly, the bill passes, no problem. And Flagler immediately gets Ida Alice divorced. In fact, he sends 2 attorneys to see her, to meet with her, and I believe it might have been her brother was with them. Anyway, she has no idea. She thought Flagler was dead. She had no idea that he was still alive. She's just really out of it completely. And so Flagler gets the divorce. A few weeks later, he travels to Kenansville, North Carolina, which is kind of about an hour outside of Wilmington, North Carolina. And at the Keenan family home, the ancestral home called Liberty Hall, they have their wedding. And that is the picture on the right, the bottom right. If you have trouble finding Henry, just look for the really old man. And standing next to him is Mary Lily. At his feet is a young girl with a haircut. That is Louise Wise Lewis, and that is who our fellowship hall is named in memory of. She becomes Mary Lily's primary benefactor, or not benefactor, but inheritor. She inherits the bulk of the estate when Mary Lily dies. To her right is William Rankinen, and William Rankinen is Mary Lily's brother. How are we doing? Okay. How long? Alrighty. So, and the picture of Mary Lily in her wedding dress is actually taken, and I have read this. It wasn't in the caption I pulled this from Flagler College Digital Archives, but I had read that fireplace is from Satan's Toe, or Indian Harbor, as Flagler did not like the name Satan's Toe. He preferred Indian Harbor. That's the winter home in Mamaroneck. But that is Mary Lily in her wedding dress. And if you go to Liberty Hall to Kenansville, I would encourage you to do that. You can see the wedding dress, and you can see just how short she was, because she was short and, dare I say, busty. But she was, again, a very intelligent woman. She had pretty much, by this point in time, she was in her 30s, which kind of meant you're an old maid. So the family had pretty much decided she wasn't going to get married. She never formed a relationship with anyone that she wanted to marry. And then Flagler pops in on the scene. So in order to seal the deal with the family, Flagler gives her a long string of pearls that was probably about $1 million in value, and then builds her a little cottage in Palm Beach called Whitehall. That's really all that it took, believe it or not. And the family was hook, line, and sinker. Her brother, William Rankinen, ends up becoming the son that Flagler never had. And he takes over some of the operations of the railroad when Flagler dies, and becomes really the business end of things. He runs the railroad and the hotel system as well. But Mary Lily is the belle of Palm Beach, and they have parties there at the house at Whitehall. They open up Whitehall. Flagler had an organist every season that would come down, and in fact, the organist, if you look at our list of our organist versus the organist at Whitehall, the names are synonymous. He used a lot of our organists down at Whitehall there. So they never had children. They had a dog named Delos, which was Flagler's favorite, and there are pictures of them riding around in Flagler's Packard with Delos like on their lap. So he was definitely a dog lover. Everything's fine and dandy until Flagler falls down the stairs at Whitehall. He probably broke his hip, and in those days, all you could really do was just make him comfortable. And they put him into one of the cottages that was attached to the breakers, and that's where, it's the Nautilus, was the name of the cottage, and that's where he passed away. Harry always blamed Mary Lily for not alerting them sooner and letting them come down and see his father before he died. But by the time Harry got there, he was pretty much, Henry was, they were using drugs and whatever to keep him comfortable, and so he pretty much had no idea what was going on. And that's one of the reasons why our mausoleum has an empty tomb. The intention was that it would be Mary Lily that would be buried there. Her story continues after Flagler, where she rekindles a romance with an ex-boyfriend. This is why exes should always be exes. And she ends up dying. They end up remarrying, and she dies within a year of their marriage. And there are rumors that he may have helped her meet her maker. And so the family buries her in Wilmington, North Carolina, just to put a lid on everything. And Harry is offered that empty tomb, and he says, no, I'm fine being buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. So anyway, so it's kind of a quick, we ran through Mary Lily, but Mary Lily is a huge, huge figure, but again, very reminiscent of his mother. You can kind of see, as you look through Flagler's relationships with women, you can kind of see this kind of trend. Of questions? No. It's in several books. Now, I will tell you there is a book that the Keenan family does not want anyone reading, and that is a book called The Binghams of Louisville. And what happened was, I can't remember, I think Chandler is the author's last name, but he wrote a book about Flagler, and he wanted it to be kind of like a tell-all. Here's the real story about the robber baron. And, you know, Flagler, we tend to think of Flagler as being kind of a nice guy, and he was. But just like any of the robber barons, there are skeletons in their closet. And Flagler had plenty of them. Well, it's more like a semester course. But he starts digging into Mary Lily, and the whole story about her potential demise. When Mary Lily dies, they had signed prenups, she and her second husband, Robert Worth Bingham, and he was the U.S. ambassador to Britain just before Joe Kennedy. I think it was right just before Joe Kennedy by FDR. Bingham becomes very big in the Democratic Party after Mary Lily dies. But anyway, so when she dies, he produces this handwritten codicil to the will that said, you know, give my husband $5 million. And so the family decides to exhume Mary Lily's body to see if there's any evidence of wrongdoing. Nothing's conclusive, and the autopsy results have never been revealed, ever. And so they end up giving him the $5 million, but they also move the body of Mary Lily to Oakdale Cemetery in Wilmington, just to kind of put it to bed. But he uses that $5 million to buy 2 newspapers in Louisville, Kentucky, and that projects him into the kind of the political scene. But anyway, it's all detailed in that book. It's a little sensational, but it's certainly kind of a little Jerry Springer-ish. No children with Ida. The only children he had were with Mary Harkness, and there were 3. We often forget about Carrie, so I always try to make sure we talk about Carrie. She was in her 30s. He was in his 70s. Yeah. He was a randy sort of guy. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think at that point, when he married Ida Alice had just turned like 34, and Flagler was in his 50s. And that's a little bit appropriate. There might have been a few eyebrows going up, but when he married Mary Lily, there were a lot of eyebrows. Barbara. So the oldest was Jenny Louise, and that's who this church is built in memory of. Carrie Harkness, Flagler, and then Henry Harkness, Flagler, or Harry. Yeah. So Harry was the youngest. And Flagler tried to bring Harry into the hotel business. He was the manager for one season. It did not go well. So that's why when William Rand Keenan came onto the scene and was interested in the business, that's why I say Flagler found the son that he always wanted, because he wanted Harry to step into that role, and Harry liked having money and liked spending money. He didn't necessarily like making it. William Rand Keenan, on the other hand, knew how to make money and keep it. And you told him about the next. Is Dr. Graham? Okay, so in April, we're going to have, for our next pop-up, Tom Graham, and he's going to come talk to us about the Anderson family. With the 200, we're rounding up the 200th anniversary of the congregation in June. We've been kind of using this whole year to kind of celebrate it. And he's going to talk about the Anderson family, who were very prominent family in the history of our congregation. I will warn you, Tom is very sarcastic, so if you like your historians on the sarcastic side, sit close, because he says it under his breath. But it's definitely, you'll be laughing, but he's just really got a lot of information about the family. And Tom is a retired Flagler professor. Of course, Tom has been a Flagler historian for years, but one of the first books he wrote was a book on the Anderson family. Hey, do you remember the name of the book? I can't remember. It's like The Making of St. Augustine or something like that. But the really confusing thing is there's a Dr. Andrew Anderson 1, and then there's a Dr. Andrew Anderson 2, which, why they do that, I think they only do that to confuse historians. But anyway, it will be a great pop-up, and you'll learn a lot. Yes, so the first Andrew Anderson was a member of our church, and his mother was a member here. And in fact, they're the ones who gave us the communion service that we use, that Hunter and Rachel use. The second Andrew Anderson was on the board of trustees, but I think he went to Trinity Episcopal. So Last Train to Paradise. It's by Les Standiford. Great book, very good intro. You can literally read it in a weekend. It's that engaging, and it's a quick read. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, Mr. Flagler's St. Augustine by Tom Graham is thicker. It's a little bit more dense. That's not a weekend read. That's a pop open a bottle of red wine and sit in the easy chair and read it and take notes. The not so friendly versions of Flagler, David Leon Chandler is the author, but the Binghams of Louisville is the one that focuses on Mary Lily. And it's out of print, but you can get it from used bookstores. And if you have a problem getting it, I got a copy. The Binghams of Louisville. Now, and I'll tell you this too, the Keenan sued to have that book not published and lost. Yeah. The other handout that got passed out, hopefully, okay, the Lighthouse, that's where my day job is, so I can do this. We are hosting a series of lectures for our 150th anniversary of the Lighthouse Tower, and our next session is in April, and it's here at Memorial, and it's going to be Leslie Keyes talking about the rise of Florida tourism and the role that Henry Flagler played. So I would hope you guys will attend. To register, you do have to register. It's free, but we are asking people to register. And this is provided through a grant from the Florida Humanities Council. So you can go on the Lighthouse website. If you have any problems, just let me know, and I can get you signed up. Okay. Sure. So Tom Graham, retired professor of history at Flagler, is going to be talking about the Anderson family. And the Anderson family, their connections to our church really go back to the very beginning, roughly like 1820s, 1830s, and continue really through the Flagler years. So he's going to talk a lot about the first Dr. Anderson, and then the second Dr. Anderson as well. Is it in there? I can't see that. Yeah, April 6th. It's on April 6th. Yes. Okay. Yes, ma'am. We will have those streamed, right?
All the pop-ups are going to be streamed this year.
Yeah. So they're available on streaming. And Tim is in the back. Thank you, Tim, running the whole system. So it's in the bulletin, but so April 6th is Dr. Anderson. June 22nd is Old Hymns and Why Matt Daniel Loves Them. featuring our own Matt Daniel. August 24th is a day in the life of our pastors. And then October 12th is an exciting and informative Flagler fireside chat. That's going to be with me and Leslie, and we'll probably get into the dirt. I can always get into dirt with Leslie, so and she knows a lot. So,
Well, thank you guys.
Thank you for coming. We appreciate it. Thanks.